What's going on, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. Dreamland by Sam Quinones again today. It's a longer chapter. It's called The Final Convenience. It starts on page 226. So I apologize if I have to clear my throat a little bit. I'm still a little bit sick. It's been a heck of a flu season, that's for sure. Still recovering, so we'll do this as painlessly as possible. 226, The Final Convenience. Charlotte, North Carolina. Few parts of the U.S. benefited more from the economic expansion that began in the mid-90s than Charlotte, North Carolina. Its metro area, which includes part of northern South Carolina, grew fastest of any metro region between 2000 and 2010. Nations Bank of Charlotte acquired Bank of America in '98, and the city became B of A headquarters. New York retirees in turn flooded the town, and Charlotte learned what a bagel was. 6 other Fortune 500 companies appeared, as did NBA and NFL franchises, and a silver skyline. Charlotte's metro area includes almost 50 golf and country clubs. The town's southern end absorbed the better-off newcomers, who transformed it from cow pastures into a sprawl of McMansions and shopping malls in less than a generation. Latino immigrants came for the jobs too. Attracted to the state by agriculture and pork slaughterhouse work, they filled in fading North Carolina rural towns, then moved to the more stable work in Charlotte. The city's Latino population grew faster than it did any in the country. Prescription pill use rose in Charlotte just as it did across the country with the pain revolution. In time, that meant more opiate addicts. For years, heroin in Charlotte was powder brought in from New York, uniformly weak and sold solely by young black men on few streets off from Statesville Avenue in the north part of town. Their clientele was limited to the modest numbers of addicts in the metro area. The Statesville area was where, in the early 90s, Brent Fauci got his training as a young narcotics officer. In his younger days, Brent Fauci spent 2 summers selling Bibles in Mississippi and the coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky. It was, as he thought later, the kind of work that stunted one's growth as a human being. He was awful at it. As he sold the New King James Version, he endured occasional lectures from Pentecostals who favored the original King James and believed the new version to be heresy. In Pikeville, in a mining region of Kentucky, a place Fauci came to regard as the end of the world, he lived in a trailer park. His neighbor was the owner of a coal mine who was hiding out because his workers had gone on strike and he was running the mine with non-union labor. Yet Fauci came to believe that it was there, selling the Bible, where his training as a narcotics officer began. A natural introvert, he had to force himself to knock on the doors of people he didn't know and keep talking. Years later, he joined the Charlotte Police Department. Early on, his narcotics sergeant ordered him to make a heroin buy on a street near Statesville Avenue. Fauci had 3 weeks earlier been there on patrol in uniform. "They're gonna know I'm a cop," he said. "Nah, don't worry, just do it," said the sergeant. "You'll be all right." So that afternoon, in plain clothes, his hair now longer and unkempt, Fauci walked onto the street. Whistles and hoots sounded the alarm. 5-0, 5-0, the dealers called, the street code for cop. Fauci approached a dealer, doing his best to look strung out. "I need something, man," he said. "You a cop, dude," the young dealer said. "No, man, I ain't a cop. I'm sick. I need something." "You a cop, motherfucker." No, I ain't." "Who that then?" The dealer pointed into some woods 50 yards away and to Fauci's partner, a large man trying to hide behind a sapling. "Dude, that's my fucking brother. He's watching me to make sure I don't use his shit after I buy it. Man, you gotta sell me this or not." Sure enough, the dealer sold him the smack. Keep talking, Fauci learned, like a salesman. If you're talking, you're still alive. Talk was the undercover cop's great gift, and Fauci came to rely on it in a time of stress. The kid wasn't stupid, Fauci thought later. He was just begging to be persuaded, letting greed control his better judgment. Street dealers made money on each sale and thus wanted to be convinced. Talk long enough, desperately enough, and you could usually get them to sell to you. Talking and convincing people, using his wits, were what selling Bibles had trained him to do. But Fauci also noticed that very little of what he learned selling Bibles and buying dope applied once the Jalisco boys arrived in Charlotte. Within years of the man's first visit to Charlotte, the Jalisco boys were crawling all over town. Fauci watched as heroin got cheaper, more potent, and more available. The market for the Statesville dope got really thin. Unlike the dealers near Statesville Avenue, these Mexican guys drove cars. Even if you did speak Spanish, which Fauci did not, you couldn't talk with them because the deal took place in a matter of seconds and then they were gone. Before the Jalisco boys, department policy forbade an undercover cop from getting into a dealer's car alone, but the Jalisco boys never sold outside their car. So one day, Fauci called the number and was told to park at a shopping center. Soon a small red four-door car passed with a Mexican at the wheel. The driver raised an eyebrow. Fauci pulled out after him. He followed the red car into a residential neighborhood and through several streets until it pulled over. Fauci radioed his location to his backup and walked over to the driver's window. The guy's car was immaculate. In the heroin world, most cars Fauci had seen were strewn with festering food, crumpled cigarette packs, and grimy clothes. But here was an older car, a heroin delivery vehicle, without a speck of trash. He handed $60 to the driver, who spit 3 balloons into his hand, gave them to Fauci, and drove off. Fauci stood in the street and watched him go, saliva-covered balloons in his hand, feeling witness to a revolution. He later wrote a thesis on the Jalisco system for a master's degree in criminal justice. In time, the Jalisco boy drivers proved easy to bust, but the cells were all but impossible to eradicate. Prison sentences that North Carolina imposed for heroin trafficking of 7 to 20 years barely affected them. This especially bothered Sheena Gatehouse, who became chief of the drug unit at the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office as the Jalisco system spread. Gatehouse had joined the prosecutor's office just out of law school. She spent her first years prosecuting misdemeanors and small drug cases, usually marijuana. Boo. She left to become a defense attorney and handled the first of the region's OxyContin abuse cases, her clients being the children of doctors. In 2009, she returned to the prosecutor's office. Black tar heroin dominated the caseload. The Jalisco boys were relentless, and what made them so was that the workers, the drivers, were disposable. The bosses didn't seem to care how many got arrested, they always sent more. Addicts were overdosing and dying around Charlotte. Gatehouse's office instituted a new rule: no easy deals on heroin cases. 20-year sentences grew common, yet this didn't affect the Jalisco system or the prevalence of their heroin. The price kept on dropping. Balloons containing 1/10 of a gram started at $5 for $100 and then went to $10 for $100. Finally, by 2011, you could buy 15 balloons of potent Jalisco black tar heroin for $100, $6.50 a dose, about the price of a pack of Marlboros, in Charlotte, North Carolina, a town that barely knew the drug a few years before. One bust in 2012 made her question the approach. Cops spent months buying from Jalisco drivers. The investigation involved a dozen officers. Finally, they busted the drivers and a dispatcher. They also took down some addicts, seizing their cell phones. 3 days later, those confiscated phones started ringing. Jalisco dealers were calling. The store was back in business, and they said, with new drivers up from Mexico. Officers hadn't even finished processing the evidence from the bust, and the store was up and running again. The drivers were not career thugs, as far as Gatehouse could tell. They were farm boys hoping for a better day through black tar. Sheena Gatehouse went back and forth on the wisdom of the tough approach. The damage they did clearly required it, but she said, quote, "We're sending a farm boy away for 20 years and have had no impact." More kids back home clamored for the chance to replace those arrested. What's more, each bus seemed to provide an opening for more crews, so that one busted crew was replaced not just by one, but sometimes with two. With competition, addicts had more numbers they could call, and Jalisco customer service kept improving. At the Carolinas Medical Center, Bob Martin saw the change as well. Martin, a former New York cop, came to Charlotte in 1996 for a job as Director of Substance Abuse Services at CMC. During his first years, when he heard of a big heroin bust, he threw up his hands. His beds were certain to fill up with junkies checking in to ride out the drought. But by the early 2000s, whenever police corralled a dozen Jalisco heroin dealers, Martin saw no new flood of addicts rushing to his beds. There was no drought. The bust didn't affect the area's supply of heroin. No matter how, quote, no matter how many million-dollar busts you guys do, he told the officers, it doesn't show up on our radar. Half of CMC's patients addicted to opiates now had private health insurance. Martin studied the zip codes where they lived and found that they came from the town's wealthiest neighborhoods: Raintree, Quail Hollow, Mint Hill. Yeah, that sounds rich as hell. Quail Hollow, Mint Hill. In South Charlotte, that had once been cow fields. These areas were also home to 9 country clubs and the region's best shopping malls. It was as if these guys from Jalisco had done market research to discover new heroin markets. This thought also occurred to a Charlotte undercover police officer who went by the name of Jamie. He had been working narcotics at the Charlotte Police Department since '07, black tar heroin mostly, buying from Jalisco dealers hundreds of times. Jamie believed that the Jalisco boys looked for towns where kids had cell phones, money, and cars, and where a lot of people were addicted to prescription painkillers. At first, he saw they were almost sadistic in the way they talked down to desperate junkies, leaving them waiting and insulting them when they finally showed up. But in 2009, that changed. After Jamie bought from them, crew bosses called to ask, was the service good? Was the runner rude? Once a crew boss called to apologize for a late driver. He had a lot of customers, he said, and he was going to get on his people to be more prompt. After another buy, Jamie's phone rang. We've heard from others that batch wasn't as good, the guy said in halting English. What did you think? If it was bad, I want to tell the guys that we got it from that we don't want that stuff anymore. Jamie had no choice but to go along. Yeah, man, it was crap, really bad. We'll make it up to you. At the next buy, his dealer gave him an extra balloon and apologies. Jamie attributed this new attitude to competition among the Jalisco crews in Charlotte. Other higher-ups in Jalisco, he figured, were imposing the quality control of a Fortune 500 company. Their service was better, he noted, than many legitimate retailers. Meanwhile, though supplies of heroin were unrelenting and addicts were everywhere, Jamie saw no outrage in Charlotte. He spoke to the parents of one junkie after another. As soon as he said the word heroin, their minds crashed to a halt. They couldn't conceive of their children on heroin. For every symptom, the parents had an answer. Did they see burned aluminum foil around the house? We thought he was burning incense. Was he slurring his speech? He was getting over the flu. Were his grades falling? He was going through a phase. Jamie spoke to the city's drug-free coalition, which was focused mainly on alcohol and marijuana. No, he told them, heroin is the real problem. He and Gatehouse spoke to a group of headmasters from Charlotte's best private schools, hoping it would ignite a local crusade. It didn't. Despite spreading addiction, no parent in Charlotte, of the dozens he spoke to, came forward to warn school groups, churches, the media. Heroin touched the families of doctors, ministers, bank executives, and lawyers, but they retreated from it, crushed by grief and the drug's stigma. How a son died with a spike in his arm was not what you talked about at the country club. A half-dozen reporters asked Jamie for contacts with parents who had lost children. He would plead with the parents to come forward and tell their stories to help keep the next kid from dying. None did. A conspiracy of silence enveloped Charlotte. Heroin seeped through the city and suburbs in South Carolina with only a few cops, prosecutors, and public health officials battling it. Jamie, meanwhile, grew philosophical. Opium was a trade good that coursed through civilizations, from Alexander the Great to the Chinese to the Turks to the Afghans, snaking out the Golden Triangle of Burma and Laos. It had been a medicine for 3 millennia as it changed shape into morphine, welcomed by soldiers, then further morphed into heroin, which street dealers promoted and spread to urban denizens. Now, in gleaming 21st century Charlotte, the clients were no longer America's outcasts. It wasn't Puerto Ricans in a rainy black alley in Spanish Harlem or East LA, gang member or some jazz acolyte of Charlie Parker. Many of the users now were the beneficiaries of the wealthiest country the world had ever known. They were white kids who lived on winding streets with garages filled with jet skis and shiny SUVs, bedrooms with every digital gadget. Jamie figured that among the Jalisco boys' greatest innovations was figuring out that a mother lode of heroin demand was now waiting to be mined in these neighborhoods if they'd only offer convenience. The Happy Meal of dope, he called it, marketed like fast food to young people. We want what we want when we want it, and thus we are entitled to get it, he said. This drug is following the same marketing strategy of every other product out there. I'll give you good heroin at a great price. You don't have to go to the bad neighborhoods, and I'll deliver it for you. In a culture that demanded comfort, he thought, heroin was the final convenience. All right, we'll continue on page 232 in the next episode. A tidal wave forming. That's the name of the chapter. Hope you're enjoying the book, guys. Keep fighting that fight.